Uh, when I talked to Professor Colin Scott, and of course my name's John Scott, we've never met until about a year ago, although I have to say the Scottish and Irish and even the Aboriginal side of my family suffered a similar fate of dispossession and removal and confinement. So it's very interesting to come together with somebody else who shares your family name and to listen to these parallels. I also was the first person in my extended family to go to university and to go to high school, to go to senior high school. Everyone else had to get a job by the time they were 14 or 15. And it was certainly my father's message was to get a job if I wanted to go to senior high school. So I'd like to, how do I follow somebody who's just shared such a personal story with us? And my job is to represent the UN Convention on Biodiversity and to link what you're doing in the room here, what the participants, what Colin is doing, to work at an international level and to make that real for people. So let me start, of course, by acknowledging the traditional owners, the Mohawk, whose lands we are gathered upon. They've always opened every meeting of the working group on traditional knowledge, and they have always given us a good outcome for our work. I look forward to being with them this afternoon. Now, as I mentioned, my name is John Scott. I'm a descendant through my father, Jack Scott, and his mother, Catherine Maud Evans, of the Aboriginal people of Central Queensland. I'm very pleased to be with you today for the opening of the first North American Conference on Biocultural Diversity. I want to acknowledge our many partners, and I'm not going to name them because after this I will actually be handing to our partners to introduce themselves, after which we will break for morning tea and then move to the language panel. So in my culture, Aboriginal Australians believe that everything in creation was dreamed into being. We call the creation itself the dreaming, and the perpetuation of life is the continued dreaming of creation. So just so, there was a dream of this event that started amongst Indigenous peoples of North America. When you assembled at the American Natural History Museum for the first International Action Dialogue on Biocultural Diversity in April 2017. So it was Indigenous North Americans who had a dream that you wanted to have this event, and that was several years ago. So it was at that meeting that Indigenous North Americans expressed a strong desire to ensure culture was at the table when people talked about conservation and biodiversity. So from that moment, 2 or 3 years ago, the Convention on Biodiversity, UNESCO, and the American Natural History Museum reached out to potential partners to work out how we could get some funding and bring such a rich group of people together so that we could pursue this dialogue on nature and culture. So it was Cicada who first came to the table a year ago as a chief partner for this event, and they saw that it could cascade in from the Cicada Indigenous Network meeting. So it was at that moment that Cicada shared that dream, and that with your help and everybody here, we made this event a reality. So this week provides an important space for frank dialogue. Now, those of you who have read the international news this morning will know that the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services has just released its assessment of the global ecosystems. 1 million species at risk. Ecosystems irreparably damaged and in further decline. Reefs on the verge of collapse. Rainforests, the Arctic ice cap melting. Needless to say, the time for action is now. The time for action is before now. We have a very small window of opportunity if humanity is not to face our own extinction in the foreseeable future. From a policy perspective, nature and culture has been artificially separated for too long to the detriment of our work. We are now living in a world that, while still ultimately dependent on biodiversity and nature as the essential infrastructure for supporting our lives and livelihoods on this planet, are often forgotten. This simple truth that we depend on nature has been forgotten. The separation of nature and culture is not possible for the indigenous peoples of the Americas, who regard themselves as the descendant of the maize or the squash, or the indigenous peoples of the Pacific, who believe they are descended from the taro. The Convention on Biodiversity cannot promote nature-based solutions to the sixth extinction crisis, the Sustainable Development Goals, or take effective climate action unless culture is at the table and indigenous peoples' traditional knowledge is alive and well, along with indigenous languages. Now, this week, we will consider the importance of biological and cultural diversity, or as I like to call it, nature and culture, for ecosystem and community resilience, and indeed for the healthy transmission and generation of traditional knowledge, to achieve the Convention's 2050 vision of humanity living in harmony with nature. And I would ask everyone in this room to think, where will you be in 2050? How old will you be in 2050? And I'm very pleased to see some young people in the room. Towards closing, I would like to leave you with two important messages about future work and the potential that this event has to make a substantial contribution to national and international policy for conservation and sustainable use of nature. It is also a unique opportunity to further strengthen the role of traditional knowledge and Indigenous peoples in the future work of the Convention. My first message to you is in the broad consultations on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework between now and the 15th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biodiversity in China, October 2020. The door is wide open to receiving ideas from Indigenous peoples for new elements of work on traditional knowledge and customary sustainable use, community conservation, and other issues of relevance to Indigenous peoples in the future work of the Convention. In our consultations so far, we have exciting proposals already being proposed by Indigenous peoples. For example, Indigenous community conservation areas, or Indigenous protected areas, as they're sometimes called in my country, as well as the in situ conservation of traditional crops and animals for local food systems, food security, are all very attractive proposals and already that have already been received by the Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, which is the Indigenous caucus that follows the CBD. These are very valuable ideas for future work. Also, the Secretariat is cognizant that Indigenous peoples have a strong desire to move beyond an observer status of the Convention to achieve a new status as recognising Indigenous peoples as partners in the implementation of the Convention. My second message and last message is about the importance of nature and culture for ecosystem and community resilience, and indeed for the healthy transmission, generation and protection of traditional knowledge. Nature and culture are inseparable, and only by recognising their intrinsic value and by addressing them together can we pave the way forward to achieve the Convention's vision of living in harmony with nature by 2050. Coherence could be found through the establishment of an international alliance for nature and culture, and this is why my executive secretary proposed this at the governing body in Egypt in November. She proposed that together with other partners, UNESCO, IUCN, and Indigenous peoples, we should reach out to establish an international alliance for nature and culture so that these issues are not dealt with in separation in future. Such an alliance could be a natural extension of a decade of work between the CBD, UNESCO, IUCN, governments and Indigenous peoples to try and understand the links between biological and cultural diversity and why those links are important for the future, our future on this planet. So the alliance could serve as an inclusive platform for governments, international agencies, Indigenous peoples, NGOs, academia, faith-based communities to work on issues relevant to nature and culture, to have robust discussions and provide some possible elements for the consideration on future work for the governing body next year that would bring about a coming together of nature and culture in the post-2020 biodiversity framework. So an international alliance could also consider further strategies to ensure that nature and culture are addressed together in the post-2020 era, such as calling on the General Assembly to declare an international decade on nature and culture 2020 to 2030. So as proponents for nature and culture, Indigenous peoples, of course, would have a special role in these mechanisms, but an international alliance for nature and culture should cause all cultures to reflect on what their relationship is with nature, to bring all nature and cultures together in the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So this week, let us create an ample space for the interplay of nature and cultures, to fully consider the collective and local actions of Indigenous peoples for human well-being and the conservation and sustainable use of nature. Let us also consider practical actions that could be taken at various levels to strengthen the links between nature and culture for human well-being. For human well-being, for the sake of nature and for the sake of a sustainable future together. So thank you. I'll stop there.